Let's talk. So, Robbie, we've had this this conversation laid out for a couple of weeks now. You were the one who brought this to the table, so you wanted to talk about the expectations of gamers.
Yeah. Obviously, what stemmed from this is the whole big Mass Effect Andromeda controversy, right? Bad facial animations, glitches and bugs and stuff like that, and how before it even came out, there was a very vocal group of people that were pretty concerned that this was a dumpster fire, and never before in my time have I seen so many people unwilling to buy a game because of all the bug reports and stuff that they've heard, right? So it kind of got me to thinking, like, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Games like, or developers like Bethesda, absolutely notorious for putting out Fallout games or Skyrim games. They're just riddled with bugs. Like that's one of Bethesda's, signatures, is the amount of bugs. Does that stop people from sinking, literally 1,000 to 2,000 worth of hours into it? No, it doesn't. We expect it of Bethesda. So it kind of got me thinking, what types of expectations should we have for games, and should those vary based on games or based on developers?
I think that it's an interesting question because, yeah, you're right. Bethesda games, and for a long time, have been riddled with bugs, and it's not like they're not, they're pretty commonplace. Most people who even play to the end of an Elder Scrolls game or a Fallout game will end up experiencing a few of them. And I think the question you have to ask yourself is, why are people experiencing bugs either in Mass Effect or in a game like Skyrim or Morrowind? And I think that's because of the amount of variables that are going on there. Now, obviously, most games coming out in the last 2 or 3 years have had a very big focus on open world aspects, and finding a narrative that can fit into that method of gameplay. And I think that there's actually a pretty big disservice that goes on there, because not every narrative is served by this nonlinear structure of just simply gating, basically section gating the map with a story that needs to be completed. So that variable, it goes from off to on, and then another section of the map gets unlocked. Final Fantasy 15 was really bad about this, where there was clearly a story mission that would take you to another section of the map, and you would be collecting quests that had markers in that off-limit area.
Final Fantasy 15 specifically, when you looked at the map, had giant hazard signs you can't go to this area yet. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that as games go more open world, it means that they do have to have a variable quest structure. So games are doing open world games with a narrative are trying to do two things at once. It's trying to give you the option of going and doing whatever you want to do, while at the same time funneling you into specific choke points to advance the narrative. And that's why you'll suddenly run out of side quests, or you'll run out of stuff to do, and it'll force you back to that story point in order to advance you onto the next piece of narrative. Now, not every narrative is really served very well by this structure, and I think that, in fact, a lot of them are not very well served by it, because what it allows your player to do is go off and fuck off and forget about the story and not develop that much of an attachment to it. What Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls have done very adeptly, because you almost don't notice this problem, is that they push you along in a story in what seems to be multiple different fashions, and gives you actually a choice. It's no longer being funneled into... You don't have a linear story with side quests dotted on the side. Everything sort of comes together in... it helps to build the world, for one, but there's a bigger overall narrative that's happening in this region or in this world, instead of just to you.
Well, and again, this is, an Elder Scrolls overall game function, or game structure, really lends itself well to this idea, but, you suddenly don't have a singular narrative that you're funneling people back toward. You now, because of the faction system, now you actually have a binary decision that you're forcing players to choose between, whether you're affiliated with Whiterun or the two warring factions. There's a lot of that kind of dichotomy and warring faction type stuff in the Elder Scrolls games, going back even to Morrowind with the Tribunal and shit like that, and the different guilds that would fight amongst each other. So you've got a structure that sort of lends itself well and adds more variables to the mix. But then you've got other games that now have come in and adopted the open world, the open world concept, and tried to fit their very linear narrative onto it. And I think that a lot of people are going, well, wait, I don't know that works so well because it's not satisfying as a game.
Well, the reason I think Morrowind did it well was their actual, like, the main narrative used so little of Vardenfell. You would go to most places, but you'd be like in and out in like a heartbeat. Whereas like the bulk of the game was actually exploring those places and learning what was going on in each of the cities, or maybe advancing through whatever guilds you were aligned with in those cities. But when you actually went back and finally went to do the linear story, like, very little of that map actually got used, which sounds like a bad thing, but it really wasn't. It made the world feel bigger than just what the main story was.
Well, and one of the recent games that actually adopted the open world thing, and I think managed to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that you mentioned about open worlds, is Horizon Zero Dawn. You get gated right at the beginning because you're still like learning the ropes and stuff like that. But once the narrative throws you out into the open world, there's nothing stopping you. You can go everywhere. And what's cool about the narrative too, at least in the beginning when you're doing these side quests, you mentioned like you run the risk of forgetting about the narrative. Or in some cases they're all like, oh, this bad thing is going on and you have to solve it before people die. But let's go do other stuff and it can wait till later.
Right.
Is that when the narrative starts out, there isn't any kind of immediate threat.
There's no urgency.
Right. There's no urgency. There's no like physical urgency. The urgency is all personal. You want to figure out and solve these problems for your character because it's something that means something to her, not because anyone's in danger, right?
Yeah.
Now, once you start getting near the end of the story and it starts putting on that urgency, either most of the side quests are gone or you start to realize, oh shit, what the fuck is going on? I really want to figure out what this is. So all those pitfalls that you mentioned, Horizon actually manages to evade all of those things. And I recently read an article too where apparently they went through hundreds and hundreds of hours worth of rewrites for that game, making sure that everything from Aloy's personal history down to side quests and the world and the lore all fit together cohesively. And again, to Horizon's credit, even though I'm sure people have found bugs, I didn't find one glitch or graphical error or anything within that game, which I think is where things like expectations come. So obviously, they can do it. And especially a game like Horizon, which was made by Guerrilla, who till this point had only done Killzone.
Right.
Now, whether or not I didn't really play, so I know those are good games or not, but obviously it's a whole different animal compared to an open world epic RPG of this proportion, right?
Yeah.
And then you see companies like BioWare who have obviously made, they have a good pedigree for games, and then Bethesda, they're coming out with these bug and glitch and addled games. So why is it different if a company like Guerrilla can get it right, hit that nail on the head perfectly with their first foray into this genre? Why is it that companies that have been putting out games like this for years and years and have experience with these different engines and these different types of games and the formulas that make these games, why does it seem that they either can't get it right, or in BioWare's case, that they seem to be going backwards in terms of graphical stuff?
Well, anytime you put in new people, new talent, a new team in place, because the team that made Mass Effect Andromeda was not the same team that made Mass Effect 3. So anytime you have that, of course you're going to have different quality standards. You know what I mean? Like, that's not... Anytime you change a creative team, it's going to take some time for that gel to happen. And so, yeah, I think, BioWare has a really strong reputation in that area for open world games, and specifically, they built Mass Effect really kind of on the heels of Knights of the Old Republic.
Well, the first 3 Mass Effects, those weren't open world in any sense. Like whenever you did a mission, I mean, it was enough to where it's not something you could like immediately like notice, but it kind of structurally you could tell it was kind of like hallway type deal. Like we go this way, this way, and you're fighting stuff as you go, right? So Mass Effect Andromeda, the gameplay, the open world aspect of it is a far cry from what 1, 2, and 3 were, but what it does lend itself more to is what Dragon Age Inquisitions ended up being.
Well, I mean, Dragon Age definitely had its own sets of problems too. But I do think that as long as we start seeing games that are more complex, that you are going to see more variables, and also, I think a lot of this comes down to play testing at the same time too. Like depending on the size of your game, there's going to be sections of the map that some people never even see, and so if your play testers don't absolutely do all of their due diligence in every single corner of the map, then yeah, you're going to end up having more glitches. You're going to end up having more problems like that. But I think the expectation is an interesting thing to address, because a lot of times it is the pedigree of a company that, the name that they're taking with them into the next title. To be fair to Mass Effect, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that there's anything that they could have done on the heels of the way that 3's ending went down, that their fan base wasn't going to have some kind of negative reaction to whatever ended up coming next.
Latched onto something, and whether or not it was a big deal, potentially blown it up.
You've got sort of that overhanging negative sentiment still from the Mass Effect 3 ending, and you could see that every time the conversation would go, like anytime anyone would start to debate Mass Effect Andromeda, because in 4 or 5 logic steps they're already bitching about Mass Effect 3's ending. So what are you really actually upset about? Like, are you actually upset that Andromeda didn't meet your expectations, or are you still just pissed that 3 didn't end the way you wanted it to?
There have been at least 5 conversations with different people where you're right, that happens. We would start with, them talking about how they're upset about the animations, right? How poor they are, all these glitches and stuff. Hasn't came out yet, so nobody's played it at this point. We're just going off of what we know. And of course, my defense is, well, there have always been some problems, glitches and animation-wise, okay? I can see where you're coming from, but there's also still so much we don't know, because one of the things that BioWare is good at, that in my opinion is better than the animations, is their lore, their storytelling, their characters, their interactions, and animation glitches or whatever doesn't have any relevance on that. I mean, okay, breaks my immersion, but that isn't going to make any of that any less stellar if that's where they're putting the most of the resources.
And this is a lot of times why game companies and devs don't want beta footage and stuff leaking out, because I'll tell you what, when I went through the Elder Scrolls Online beta, before it was out, there were so many problems with that game that existed in that build that it really turned me off from trying to make an actual run at it. And that sentiment has pervaded till this day. Clearly they've overcome that, and clearly they've fixed those problems, but it's still in the back of my head something that just kind of sits there.
Yeah, so now that I've finally been able to play, you're right, watching it, I can definitely see, like, yeah, they look like they have bug eyes sometimes. I ran into glitches in some cases. There's one side quest, in fact, that I can't complete now. It's a tiny little thing that contributes nothing, but whatever. I've had times where allies have died and I can't res them, so I have to reload. So there are bugs in it. Not saying that there aren't.
So what is it that makes it? Because sometimes, a lot of times when you experience shit like that, it's funny, right? Like the reaction is, "Oh, dude, that's hysterical." Let me get